Whoa, it's Wulzy. Welcome back to another Geometry Dash building video. Today I have a completely different style of video that I want to try out. It's a video where I'm trying to create with as little objects as possible. If you enjoy this video format, hit the subscribe button, let me know, I would love to hear. Low object challenges are becoming more and more common lately, with many creators trying to learn spawn loops, which is where you reuse a set of triggers, in order to create very cool looking levels in 100 objects or 1000 objects as part of a set object challenge. I really like this example, which is Blafusku by RNBW. This level only uses 100 objects in total and has this crazy layering background, which is just super cool. As you can see right here, it has a very creative use of some text objects in order to create multiple zigzags with only 16 objects. As an avid effect creator, this concept really intrigues me. Since it's very difficult to create something very good looking and eye-catching with such a low object count, I haven't really found it very easy to get into this whole genre of levels, until I saw this level Untitled Unmastered by Para, which is a 1000 object only challenge. As you can see, there's a lot of rotations and movements with the X objects in the background. There's a crazy atmosphere when it's played with the full song, but man, this is what inspired me to create this video. I want to try and at least make a background with a very low object count using a couple of spawn trigger loops. This is where my video takes a different turn than normal, and what I'm actually about to create is predetermined. I've been traveling lately, and on transport and little breaks I get in between, I've taken that opportunity to try and experiment and make a low object background in advance for this video. So making this background is going to be completely predetermined. I already know exactly what I'm going to do, which is probably for the best anyway, because a lot of it is very procedural, and I would probably mess it up if I tried to commentate it live. I need one color channel, and it's gonna be a slightly desaturated bluish purple using blending, and blending is very important for what I'm about to pull off. Blending basically treats a color channel like light, so if you stack two objects on top of themselves, it basically combines their brightness and their hue in that specific spot to create a new color. So now for my background, I am going to use these little ground spike objects, which aren't harmful. I'm going to scale them up to 2 times of their regular size, set them to that color channel number 1, and give them the very first available group, which is 1. Here I'm using 2 objects that are opposed to each other, then I'm going to copy paste and rotate that again. So we have 4 objects in this little plus shape. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag the opacity slider down to a point where it's a little bit more tame and it blends more into the background, because when it's very bright and opaque, you can tell exactly what object it is and the effect becomes less impressive in my opinion. I'm going to change the game mode to a ship, playtest it, and I'm going to move it to the point where it is centered in the screen, which just requires an extra little half a block shift upwards. Little tip for moving objects: if you want to move them only a small amount and not a full grid shift with WASD, what you can do is click a tiny object and the grid will actually change size so you can move them half a space. There is going to be 3 layers to this background. I'm going to copy paste this one, increase the editor layer. Now before I do anything else, what that does is it basically lets me sift through the different objects I've placed in the level. So what I could do is click this very left arrow and it will display all of the layers. But if I'm wanting to select a specific layer of this, what I would do is just go to the one which I've set aside. And what I am going to do to this object is change the hue of it to 120. For this specific object that has the HSV value of it changed, it will shift the color of this around the color wheel so you can see there's a clear difference in the color that it is, and I don't have to use an extra color channel or anything like that because the HSV is just applied to this specific object. And to make that stand out, I'm going to rotate it 45 degrees like so. Now once I deselect and go to view every layer, you will see that the colors are starting to mix, and because of the gradient of this spike object, it is stronger in some places and not so strong in other places. And it looks like the background, which I set to black at the very beginning, is consuming this object and making it look a bit more gloomy. Then what I'm going to do is select the entire bunch, copy paste it once more. I'm going to change the editor layer, which is appearing as mixed because I've used 0 and I've used 1 on different objects that are in this. I'm going to set this to 2. Everything is still on group 1. So all of this still has the same group property to it. The only difference is that its orientation is different because I've rotated it. Hue has a maximum of 180. Plus 180 is the same as minus 180. So if you take into consideration the entire slider, which ranges from minus 180 to plus 180, there's a possibility of 360 different hue values. Now, since there's 3 layers, I'm using 0 on one layer, 120 on the other layer, and 240 on the final layer, which is the equivalent of minus 120. So now here's my final layer. You can see it's a lot more built upon than the other ones, but all together we have this cool pattern that is actually quite bright around in a circle, and the middle is left pretty empty, which is pretty important because we're about to start adding rotations to it, which is going to change the whole way that it looks and make it a lot more visually appealing. I'm going to add a color change at the very beginning on color channel 1, which is what everything is bound to. And my predetermined color that I'm changing this to is a light yellow, which is very similar in its position inside this box to the default right here, where it's slightly desaturated. I'm actually going to click that button and just shift it round to yellow like so, making sure I tick blending on the way out. Let me just show you what turning off blending does. Now, it just becomes a really bad mesh of colors because the way blending works is it changes brightness to opacity. And I'm going to crank the fade time on this color trigger to a nice 15 seconds. So we get a very slow and gradual shift in color on this object. There you go. So now if I press pause, you'll see next up, I'm going to do a little bit of spawn looping. I explained this very briefly in the beginning of this video, but spawn looping is the process of repeating a group of triggers over and over again. I'm going to go ahead and type a new group ID, number 2, into that box and set the delay to a nice short 0.1. These buttons at the bottom don't matter for this trigger because this is simply the trigger that is going to call the rest, but it's going to be important in a second and I'll explain what's going on. Now, it's important that the next set of triggers actually calls itself after this point. So I'm going to copy paste this trigger, spawn trigger it, and multi-trigger it. So basically what spawn triggered means, this little box down here, is that this trigger is only going to be activated once this object is actually going to call it. So this trigger becomes active. It needs its own group ID so that it spawns itself and keeps on spawning itself with that delay of 0.1, which I'm actually going to change to a 0.05 because we want a very quick repetition of a rotation trigger with 0 move time. So there we have our little construct. We're now going to set out a rotate trigger, which is focused on our normal group, the one on all of these spikes, number 1. It's going to have 0 move time. This also needs to be spawn triggered and multi-triggered. Correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the multi-trigger box is that this trigger will happen multiple times and it's basically going to allow itself to be looped. But I could be wrong. That's just how I understand it, and that's how it's going to make sense for this specific example. I want these objects to rotate 15 degrees in 0 seconds. And due to this spawn trigger down here, this rotation trigger is going to happen every 0.05 seconds. Now, you may notice that there's no center group ID on the right hand side here. I've just left it blank at 0. Same thing. You can't use group 0 for anything. Something I could do if I wanted this all to rotate together is set up an object right in the middle that has a new group 3, and I would add that to the rotation trigger. So that would collectively rotate around the center. But what I'm actually doing by leaving the center blank is saying, hey, this object is going to rotate around itself. It will calculate its own center and it will rotate around that point. And that goes for every single object across every single layer because it's all on group number 1. So this is actually going to create the illusion of a lot happening even though it's just one rotation trigger being looped over and over again. The last thing I need to do is put the spawn ID, which I'm spawning every single time, into the edit group of this rotation. It's going to display a very vastly changing aesthetic, which is going to give the illusion that there's a lot going on. I'm using cheats to slow this down, but when I press play, you will see that this is just rotating every object around in a very cool looking pattern. So when I tweet this after this recording, I imagine a lot of people will be confused about the true number of objects. And you'll now see the importance of the fact that I'm using an object with a gradient and I am stacking the colors on top of themselves. I'm going to quickly set down a move trigger that locks this movement to the middle of the screen at all times, which is very simply going to be done by targeting group ID number 1, i.e. every single spike object that's there, locking it to the player's x-axis for that period of time that we said, which is going to be 20 seconds. On my way out of the editor to test this in normal mode, you'll see that the editor says the length of the level is 2 seconds, and that's because the last object in the level is somewhere around where my mouse is. I'm going to quickly extend that so we can get a better look of this effect in motion by just putting a spike that's under the ground. It's never going to be seen. Now you see the length is 16 seconds. We're going to save and play, and this background is now continuously spinning. It's got a very cool color pattern to it. It's slightly changing, which you can't 100% tell, but you see it's going on forever because it's just continuously calling itself. Now, to top things off, I'm going to create a secondary spawn loop, which is going to continuously change the color of it even more. I'm going to set up my spawn trigger with a new group ID, number 3, with the 0.1 delay, which I just find to be a classic number to use. Yet again, we need to have another spawn trigger that is going to spawn the new set 3 over and over again after we've initially spawned it. So it needs to be spawn triggered, multi-triggered, so it can happen more than once. We're going to put group ID number 3 in there, and I'm going to put the delay to something like 0.7 or 0.8. I'll figure it out. And this needs to have its own group ID in the edit group tab. Now we have a pulse trigger. This is going to target group number 1, which is the spikes yet again. We set a 0.7 delay, so I'm going to have a 0.35 and a 0.35 on the fade in and out, and I'm going to make it go to a light green. I need to spawn trigger, I need to multi-trigger, and I need to give it the new spawn group number 3 in the edit group tab. And that should be it. We have a total of 24 objects, but that in its essence is a cool looking background with only 24 objects. And I'm going to post this on Twitter challenging people to guess how many objects this background actually is. I've deliberately chosen an object with a gradient that has a lot of different shapes in it. You see that this ground spike has like multiple different triangles. So when it's actually in motion, you see they look like triangle objects. It's going to look like a lot more than it actually is. And hopefully this is going to inspire a lot of people to create a little bit differently and try and be a bit more conservative with object usage, because a lot of levels that get released these days, especially the ones with big views on YouTube, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of objects, and even use hacks to increase the object limit away from 40,000, and sometimes use like upwards of 100,000 objects, and that just causes problems for Geometry Dash because the game engine, no matter how high spec your computer is, cannot handle that at all. I've given this tweet 45 minutes to sit, and it has 236 replies so far. I just want to see what people are actually thinking. 17, 11, 74, 6, 51, 237. So these are all pretty low because obviously if I'm making that tweet, people are going to expect it to be low, but we got a couple of 300s, 210, 264, 340, 1,300. That's just insulting. Someone said 23. Furorem, a very talented art creator, said 22. That's knowledge right there. 1,600. I think that's the highest guess so far. Oh! We do have a 24 in there. If you tamper with the delays and stuff on any of those spawn triggers, you can really change the whole dynamic of any effect that you create with them. It's just such a cool little mechanic that's object saving and also very useful. But yeah, thank you for watching this Geometry Dash effect building video with low objects, whatever I'm going to title this video. I think it was cool. I'm glad that I've got use out of my tiny little effect that I built on a train. Actually took me about 5 minutes. I don't mean to flex, but check the links in the description. Leave a like and subscribe, and have a good day.